What is going on, everybody? Welcome to the reveal of number 6 in my power rankings, a deep dive into the Minnesota Vikings. Now, number 6, this is going to be a spot or two lower than most people are going to have them. You know, I don't want this to be a pessimistic outlook. I think this is a very good team. It's one of the most talented rosters in the NFL. Most people say it's the best. You know, I do think they have holes, and we're going to talk about those holes in this video. But, you know, they get to the conference championship, but it was a depleted NFC. No Aaron Rodgers, no Jimmy Garoppolo as he entered a 0-11 team. Injuries took teams like Seattle, Arizona, New York out of the equation. Dallas had a really weird year. So, you know, like I've been saying in all these deep dives, it's a new league framework. You can't just take that 13 win total and apply it to the next year. It's a new season. This is a very new look team. You got new offense coordinator, new quarterback. So while I'm lower, it's still a damn good football team. It's not like I'm doing this team like I did Jacksonville and moving them all the way down to 23. You know, I do think this team is a legitimate contender this year, even if I like other teams a little more. So in this video, we're going to break down this team positionally, rank how they stack up group by group with the rest of the NFL, and then look at the schedule and really talk about my win expectations for this team this year. So let's start with Kirk Cousins. And man, I'm going to pick and choose my words carefully here. You know, I'm not very high on Kirk Cousins, but was this the right move for Minnesota? And yeah, I think it was. I think this team recognizes they're a defensive-minded team, just like every team in the last decade that has won a Super Bowl with a great defense. You've got a certain window, you know, your players age, your good role players get poached in free agency. I think Minnesota recognizes they got about a 2-year window here to get this thing done, but they needed a higher ceiling at quarterback, and that's what Kirk Cousins brings. So let's talk about Kirk Cousins on the Vikings. What is he? I think he's Carson Palmer, a very similar version of Carson Palmer. What he's going to offer now is the potential to use the entire field. On a week-to-week basis, this offense now has a much higher ceiling. What Kirk Cousins offers that you did not have in Case Keenum, and you could even argue Teddy Bridgewater if they did choose to bring him back. You know, hindsight's always 20/20. Maybe that would have been a better call here as a cheaper Teddy Bridgewater, but anyway, you know, at the time, this was the right decision. I digress. What I was saying is, say you are in the NFC Championship and the Eagles get out 14-0. Kirk Cousins gives you a chance to throw your team back into that game, and in a hurry, because he uses that deep ball so well. He's got weapons here to do it. So you now have that high ceiling, but there is a problem here in that he is going to throw more interceptions. He's not as mobile. It's a poor offensive line. This is by far the worst offensive line that Kirk will have ever played with in the NFL. So he is going to have to show us the ability to get rid of the ball quicker, maybe improve his ability in the pocket, extending plays a little more. So I do think, as far as the regular season is concerned, there's going to be a few games where Kirk Cousins doesn't look all that great, especially considering the offensive line situation. But big picture here, the ceiling is higher with Kirk Cousins than Case Keenum. There's no denying that. But there's also no denying that a lot of the success that this team had last year was predicated on Case Keenum's mobility to hide some of the weaknesses that this team has on the offensive line. And in doing that, they were able to open up throwing lanes for these receivers to go up and get it. So they're going to have to totally recreate this offense with a new quarterback here, but they got some pieces to do it. So let's move on and talk about those pieces. So running back, I have Minnesota tied for 12th at running back. There's a lot of hype around Dalvin Cook. I think a lot of it's justified, but it is a lot of hype for a guy who had injury questions coming out of college. I hate to, you know, bring up injuries, but it's a real thing, and he's just added an ACL to that docket. So I do like Dalvin Cook. I think he's a slightly less explosive Jamal Charles, who also had a lot of injury problems. But if you want to talk fantasy football for a second, you know, I'm not buying Dalvin Cook this year. I just don't think Minnesota wants to rush him in, rush him back, knowing what he can mean for this team in the playoffs. If they can keep him healthy, they have a good backup in Latavius Murray. So I actually think Latavius Murray is undervalued for fantasy football. Dalvin Cook's going to have a few big weeks when they really need him, but I think in the big picture, this is going to be like a 60-40 split in favor of Cook. You know, I think what he means to this team is more important than what he's going to put up in terms of statistics. And then also keep an eye on Rock Thomas, undrafted free agent, very similar type of profile to Isaiah Crowell, a little more shifty and more of a receiving back with a little less power, but a former 5-star prospect who was troubled, has now found his way in the NFL. Maybe he can straighten some things out and become a future piece of this team. So let's move on to the receivers here, where they rank tied for 6th. I think this is the best 1-2 punch in the NFL. Adam Thielen, Stefon Diggs. What impresses me the most about these guys is how they redefined, at least for me, what I think about in terms of jump ball. You know, they're not the biggest receivers. Thielen is 6'3", but Diggs is like 6 feet. But these guys are two of the best in the entire league of boxing players out, really elevating and attacking the ball before the D-back can really get a chance to play on the ball. They really just lay their bodies on the line. It's really impressive. And what's kind of scary now is the fact that now that you have Kirk Cousins, we could be talking about them doing this 30, 40 yards downfield and not just, you know, on 15-yard out routes and stuff. So you got two true number one receivers there. And then you got, it's actually Kendall Wright, not Jarris Wright. Same number, same last name, and more importantly, pretty much the same exact player, both prototype slot receivers. They let go of Jarris to bring in the cheaper option in Kendall Wright. You know, I think he's about 90%, 95% maybe of what they had in Jarris. But when you see Wright catching passes, just know it's a different player. And then Laquan Treadwell. I know a lot of Vikings fans want to continue to believe. You know, I just see another Dorial Green-Beckham, Justin Blackmon, Corey Coleman, you know, a guy who had so much physical ability, succeeded early at the college level, and just never really found out how to work, got to the NFL, and couldn't really carry things with his athleticism anymore. You know, maybe he'll turn it around. He's still young, but I'm done believing in him. He's a guy I was pretty high on when he came out. And then Stacey Coley as well, 7th round pick last season. I think he's a guy that can play, so keep an eye on him. And then we also factor in tight ends here. Now, Kyle Rudolph, I think, is one of the most overrated players in the entire league. You know, I don't mean to rip on the guy, but when you are a legit 6'6", 260-pound tight end and a real inline tight end, you know, we're not talking about Evan Ingram or Trey Burton here. When you are a real tight end and you don't block and you don't really develop your blocking and don't show a good effort when you have the physical ability to be one of the best blocking tight ends in the game, I just have a hard time buying into that. And it's not like he creates any separation as a receiver. He's very slow. And on top of that, he drops open passes. So while he's a good jump ball guy and his touchdown numbers might make people think he's a little better than he is, you know, I'd rather have David Morgan here who blocks like hell, and you got to pay about an eighth of what Kyle Rudolph is going to cost you. So as this team deals with some salary cap issues coming up after this year, I have a hard time seeing them keeping Kyle Rudolph, who's in the last year of his deal, probably going to be a cheap cut as opposed to paying him $7.5 million. I think this is going to be the last year of Kyle Rudolph in Minnesota. Also a 5th round pick in Tyler Conklin, who frankly is another guy like David Morgan, who I'd rather have a Tyler Conklin making $650,000 than Kyle Rudolph making $7.5 million, because Conklin's going to block and he offers almost as much as Rudolph in the receiving game. So I'm harsh on Rudolph, but I want to get that take out there. And then let's talk about this offensive line. We've already mentioned that it's not a good group. You know, you got the left tackle, Riley Reiff. You know, he's a starting caliber left tackle, something you got to overpay for and something they did in free agency. You know, it's just a necessity now. Offensive line becoming the hardest position in the NFL. I would actually argue getting a starting left tackle is harder nowadays than getting a starting quarterback. Sounds crazy, but we get more good quarterbacks entering in the last couple drafts than starting left tackles. So it is what it is. The interior here stinks. You got Tom Compton. Mike Remmer's going to move to guard, which opens up a huge hole at right tackle. You got Pat Elflein, the 3rd round pick. Good player, keeps things intact here, but not a huge impact. And then who the hell's playing right tackle here? Is it Rashad Hill? Is it the 2nd round pick who's a wildly raw prospect in Brian O'Neill? I mean, we make fun of the Giants for having Eric Flowers at right tackle, but I think the Vikings might be in a worse spot at right tackle. So that's going to be really interesting. You know, Kirk Cousins is going to have to change his game unless that right tackle position can take a jump up. So you got a few pieces here. I've got him tied with a few other teams for 25th in the league, but I'm definitely lower on this offense as a whole. You know, they have the sex appeal in the receivers and the big name quarterback and the young running back, but the beef here really stinks. And I think you look at some of the other offenses in the NFC, and when this team's got to put the pedal to the metal, I think there might be a few times that this offense lets this team down. Luckily, you do have, as we transfer over to the other side of the ball, the number 1 defense in the NFL. And frankly, the best home field advantage. And when this team is playing at home, you got to play perfect, because their pass rush is going to get after you. They play amazing run defense. They're super disciplined, and they just totally feed off the crowd. I live in Minneapolis. I've seen it firsthand. So let's break this defense down. We do that by run defense, pass rush, and linebackers, and then look at the D-backs. So let's start with the run defense, where this team is going to rank first in the NFL. It all starts with Linval Joseph. What a just massive individual, but he's a damn good football player to boot. He's right behind Damon Harrison for the best run-defending defensive lineman in the NFL, but he can rush the passer as well. And then you add Sheldon Richardson, probably a little better as a pass rusher than in run defense, but a really solid player, former all-pro caliber player. Wasn't quite playing at that level in Seattle, but still a decent-sized upgrade on the interior there. Also keep an eye on Jaleel Johnson. He's a 4th-round pick out of Iowa. Low center of gravity guy, good run defender. Player I liked coming out quite a bit. And I think Minnesota's liking him quite a bit too, because you don't really let your depth leave in Tom Johnson and Shamar Stephen if you're not high on the young talent there. So I think Jaleel Johnson could be a good third here. Then you got David Perry, who's a true nose tackle they brought over. And they draft Jalen Holmes in the 4th round. Now he's kind of a hybrid guy, sort of that Michael Bennett role that every 4-3 team in the league seems to want nowadays. I think rightfully so. So he's a good interior pass rusher. I don't think he's going to offer much in terms of run defense though. Also more of a developmental guy. Don't think he's going to play a whole lot. And then you get to the pass rush where they rank 4th. Now you got Everson Griffin, who I think is underrated. Definitely a top 10 edge rusher, such a monster. I think he is the most important player on this entire defense that is just loaded with stars. But then on the other side, you got Danielle Hunter, who just got paid to play like a superstar pass rusher, though he has not done that yet. He has played at a very high level, one of the best number 2 pass rushers that any team could ask for, but has the upside to become an even better player than Everson Griffin. Just such a freak. Was drafted very young coming into the league, so getting a second contract here. I think he's only 24. And I'd love to see him continue to refine his game to where he could become just a freaking menace. And if that happens in this window that we've been talking about, I mean, my goodness, look out. Not a whole lot of depth in terms of pass rush. You do have Brian Robeson there. He's on the very back end of his career, mostly just a run defending edge at this point. You know, might have a few tricks up his sleeve in pass rush, but, you know, he's probably not going to be getting after the quarterback too much. And then the depth is really no one to talk about. And then you talk about the linebackers here, and they rank tied for 9th. Eric Kendricks just got a huge deal. Can't really say he's underrated anymore after you see the contract he just got. Needs to stay on the field. Not sure he's finished a season playing 16 games yet, but obviously they see him as a huge impact on this defense, and I tend to agree. Really good in coverage, and underrated as a run defender at his size as well, and just the captain of that defense in general. And then you got Anthony Barr, who is just such a freak. You know, a lot of people know of, you know, a very notable player, a big hitter, a guy that can make a lot of impact plays, but on a play-to-play basis, you just got to see more consistency. There's a reason he's the last guy to get paid on this team. I think they have serious questions on if he's worth paying that $13-14 million asking price for a guy who has poor discipline in terms of his pass coverage and doesn't play run defense inside the tackles as well as you'd like to see a guy his size do. You know, he's a converted edge rusher. He still has yet to learn how to become a really good stand-up cover linebacker. Obviously has that potential, but just hasn't put it all together yet. I think to this point has had a pretty overrated career. So we'll see if in a contract year he can finally take that step. And then you got Ben Gideon. You know, he's going to play on those 15% of snaps where you actually run a base defense nowadays. He's fine, solid run defender, whatever. Not a whole lot of depth. Eric Wilson there, he's a good athlete. Kentrell Brothers. And then you move on to the secondary, where I rank them 6th. Now I just released my Madden ratings. I think a lot of people are looking forward to hearing me explain why I have Xavier Rhodes as, I believe, the 16th or maybe tied for 14th or so corner in the league. You know, we're talking about a guy that a lot of people hear that he is a top 5 corner, which I totally understand. You know, he is the ideal size, speed that you want in a corner. He plays on an elite defense. He shuts down some of the best receivers in the game. You know, I get all that. I do. That's why I rank him as high as I do. But the fact of the matter is, talking about a guy who hasn't played at an elite level until he was surrounded by just exceptional talent. You know, he had a really rough first 2 years of his career. Talking about a guy who's a 7.29 3-cone drill. With those not familiar with combine scores, that's going to be in probably the bottom 5 percentile for cornerbacks, and that's your agility work. So, you know, you can see why he might get so many flags. He doesn't have that quick twitch that you like to see in a lot of corners. So while he is an excellent press man corner, really good straight line runner. When he plays other big receivers like Mike Evans, he's just going to take those guys out of the game. I think he's a really good corner. I'm just not as high and as sold on him as the mass majority of people. Also, by the way, the 46th ranked corner on PFF last year, and I think that was the highest ranking he's had in his career. So I do want to point out there are holes in Xavier Rhodes' games that I do not think are covered on a day-to-day basis by SportsCenter and NFL Network. And then you've got kind of an interesting room behind him. So they bring in Mike Hughes, first-round pick, which shows you they kind of share my belief here that the depth here is not very good at corner. I think they are able to hide a lot of the weaknesses in Trae Waynes and Mckenzie Alexander. Now, Trae Waynes, you can say a lot of the same things with him as you say about Xavier Rhodes. Wayne's a little smaller and faster in a straight line, but a guy that has shown serious inconsistencies. I think he is very much in a competition here with Mckenzie Alexander, who by all accounts is having a good offseason, but is a guy that isn't really loved in the locker room, kind of inconsistent work ethic. He projects as sort of a nickel corner, and then Mike Hughes, who's been all the talk of training camp. So I think Mike Hughes has a very good chance at winning a starting position here, and I think where he plays is going to come down to who wins between Trae Waynes and Mckenzie Alexander, who are two guys that I'm not very high on. I think if Waynes wins, you stick Hughes in the nickel, and if they like Alexander, you stick Hughes on the outside and put Trae Waynes on the bench. So that'll be interesting. The next 2 weeks are really going to be telling for what this secondary looks like. It's definitely helped as well by the safeties here. With the addition now of George Iloka, this could be the best group of safeties in the NFL, because you got Harrison Smith, who I think is easily a top 3 safety, and then it just comes down to preference, because you got Earl Thomas, who's the best center fielder. You got Eric Berry, who I think if is his 2016 self, you take him over Harrison Smith, but both Smith and Berry offer that added physical element that Earl Thomas doesn't have, so it really just comes down to preference and scheme at that point. But I think Smith is the second most important player on this defense behind Everson Griffin. Just his versatility is so meaningful here. Then you got Andrew Sendejo, solid veteran safety, struggled earlier in his career, but to nobody's surprise has been more successful now that he's surrounded by talent. So he's a starting caliber guy, but I think there's a reason they brought in George Iloka. Just overall a more physically gifted player. So interested to see what they do now that they have 3 safeties. I actually would not be surprised. We talked about sort of the weaknesses at that number 3 corner. I wouldn't be surprised at all if they start to run some 3 safety looks here, bringing Harrison Smith almost into the box as a linebacker, nickel corner type, and then just having Iloka and Sendejo deep, 2 guys who can also play in the box. So I do think they're going to get all 3 of these involved. It's going to be interesting. I also think George Iloka is going to be good for the development of Jaron Kearse. Iloka is Zimmer's guy, who he handpicked in Cincinnati when he was the defensive coordinator there. I think when they drafted Jaron Kearse in the 7th round last year, who is a 6'4" safety with some physical upside, I think that is the prototype that Zimmer wants in that safety. So keep an eye on that right there. Also keep an eye on Holton Hill, undrafted rookie out of Texas. Haven't heard a lot of news about him, but an uber talented player with some off the field stuff going on. Reason he didn't get drafted. And that is going to wrap up the look at this roster. As far as coach and culture is concerned, I got this team second in coach and culture. I think Mike Zimmer might even be underrated as a head coach. Super good defensive mind. When you talk about coaches, you want him to know football well, but he also needs to be able to instill a culture, set the tone, and make sure everyone knows what their job is and what is expected of him. And Mike Zimmer is right up there. The culture here in Minnesota has taken such a jump up from what it was from all the coaches before Mike Zimmer. So let's move on and talk about the schedule here. And for an NFC schedule, the NFC North really just in general lucked out because they get to play the AFC East. And in both Minnesota and Green Bay's case, they lucked out in getting Buffalo at home, a team that is totally bipolar home in a way. The only reason to bring that up is, that's one game in a super tight NFC. That could actually play a huge role in what all is said and done at the end of the season. So Minnesota is going to start with San Francisco at home. That's going to be such a good game. I think that's going to be a battle. You guys know I'm very high on San Francisco this year, but I did give that to Minnesota. Just so hard to play at US Bank Stadium. Then you got to go to Green Bay. I have them splitting with Green Bay this year. Mentioned Buffalo at home. They should be able to handle that. You got to go to the Rams, then go to Philly. So, you really are knocking off the hardest part of your schedule early on. So I do have them taking 3 tough road losses. This Vikings team is definitely a much better team at home than away. That applies to every team, but I think for defensive-minded teams, that variance is even higher. But then a nice chunk in the middle there, Arizona, the Jets. I think they can take care of New Orleans at home, Detroit, Dallas. Go to Chicago. Chicago actually plays this team really well over the last 3 years, so I did give them a loss there. Could definitely have a question mark next to that one. And then beating Green Bay, I think they actually match up really well with New England. I think it's the teams that have dominant D-lines and good pass rushes that are going to give Minnesota the most trouble. And then you go to Seattle, a game that lost, I think between that New England and Seattle game, they win one and lose one. So flip the coin, and then I got them finishing out with 2 wins. So I think this is an 11-win team. Their over-under is set at 10. I do think there are other bets. I think there is a certain floor here that is maybe a little lower than what they had last year just because of the Kirk Cousins situation. I think it's going to work out just fine. But I also see a world where it actually kind of is a disaster just because of the offensive line. We've never seen Kirk Cousins behind an offensive line of this caliber. He's had Trent Williams, Morgan Moses, Brandon Sheriff, Spencer Long. He's had a really good offensive line the last 3 or 4 years. Talent that this team simply doesn't have. So we'll see when I get into my full prediction show at the end of these deep dives how far into the playoffs I think this team could go. I do have them as a playoff team right now, and we'll see in about a week or so where I end up putting them. Looking forward to that big prediction show. So Vikings fans, let me know. Too high, too low? What did I miss? Whether you agree or disagree, do hit that like button if you enjoyed. Helps me out a lot. Follow me on Twitter at TFG_football for all my live reactions to stuff. Cheers as always, guys. We'll see you next time.